Hey, I've actually made several videos in the last month. I just haven't posted them because I don't think they were very good. Anyway, check out my newly redesigned website. Again, 26ofjuly.com. But first, let's talk about Tibet. When you're talking about Tibet, you're talking about the Tibet Autonomous Region, a region that was known as an independent state for an entire generation. In fact, throughout ancient history, it seems that whenever Tibet was contacted by the outside world, they were infected by such internal conflict that whomever they contacted saw it necessary to assert dominion over them. The first such invasion in modern times was by the British, who massacred Tibetan people while they blazed a path to the capital, by which time the Dalai Lama had fled to Mongolia. He was quickly deposed by the Chinese government, and there's really not much else to report, believe it or not, other than when the Republic of China was formed in 1912, Tibet claimed sovereignty. And the Dalai Lama, alive at the time, came back from India. So screw all that, other than pointing out the Tibetan leaders' tendency to run and complain how they've been taken advantage of time and time again while leaving their people to fend for themselves. Alright, moving on. When the 17-point agreement was signed in 1951 after invasion by the People's Republic of China, Tibet had been an independent state for a whopping 38 years, and most of Tibet was redistributed among its people who before then had been serfs to Tibetan aristocrats and monasteries, which made the Tibetan people happy, so the story goes, just not the leaders who had been in India for all these years. For those of you who don't know, calling them serfs is a polite way of calling them slaves. So what, right? If that's their religious beliefs call for, huh? Think about it this way. When one of those Christian fundamentalist families in America prays instead of taking their child to the doctor and the child dies, what do? Well, it happened like a week ago, and the parents were arrested for neglect. Now, no one gives a shit about your religious sensibilities when you're harming others, and Tibet is known as the last independent government to encourage slavery, which is exactly what the Tibetan leaders intend to do should they become an independent state. Now, on what authority can I make such an accusation? Historical evidence. Tibetans have been known throughout history as an isolated, backwards people, relying heavily on their religious leaders for, well, everything. The leader of the government is the Dalai Lama, a supposedly reincarnated soul who is, by birthright, the leader of the Tibetan peoples. Think about that for a moment. All that talk about Sharia law in the Middle East is nothing compared to Tibet, led by a god king in exile who has thousands of loudmouth hippies all around the world harassing the Olympic torch holders while there are rumors of mass suicides in protest of the Olympic Games. You heard me right. God king. God king under the Lamist government. Priests are in control. There's a little joke in archaeological circles concerning the construction of the pyramids in Egypt. People say that we couldn't do it today, and the archaeologist's response is, well, unless we return to a theocratic system of government ruled by high priests and a god king willing to devote the entire gross national product to their belief in pyramid power, no one would want to. Now, I'm not a huge supporter of the Chinese government, but let me point out a few quick facts about Tibet. Number 1. Despite the worldwide retard loudmouth hippie belief in any supposed genocide of the Tibetan people, the population has increased since 1951 by over 1 million. There is no evidence of any genocide or even a massacre. The last one of those in Tibet was committed by the British in the 1800s. Number 2. Life expectancy during the Tibetan theocratic rule by the God King was an estimated 30 to 40 years old, and has increased to around 60 years old since 1951, except for the aristocracy and the high priests, who averaged 50 to 60 years and actually only comprised about 25% of the male population, not the females. Number 3. Infant mortality was estimated to be as high as 90 deaths per 1,000 births at any given time during the God King's rule, and has dropped to around 7 per 1,000 nowadays. That's pretty good improvement, I think. The rumor that they are allowed only one child is wrong. That only applies to the Han population of China. The Tibetans can have as many as they like, but they may have been discouraged during the God King's rule because of the infant mortality rate and the fact that 9 out of 10 children were born slaves, and girls were just as unwanted in Tibet as in China because men work harder and women are baby factories. Only need one of those per household. Number 5, hospitals and schools did not exist in any relative sense for both needs. Only monasteries offered these services, and the teaching was all about religion, and the medicinal structure was based on what we here in the Western world call alternative medicine. That might explain the 30-year life expectancy. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm about as Darwin as they come. Let them die young, I care not. I'm just tired of all the bullshit. And a final fact, not a single government entity in the world recognizes the Tibetan government's legitimacy based almost solely on the facts I just gave you. Now, some of the facts just presented have been disputed by the Tibetan government in exile, and I still don't know why we show them so much respect by calling them a government. Anyway, their source for these disputes, a magazine article back in the 70s, and they openly say that they would have modernized without the intervention of the Chinese government anyway, a clear self-recognition of their backwards habits, and I have to ask, when were they going to start? There are thousands of testimonies by Tibetans who were born slaves and moved away after the Chinese takeover, who are inexplicably alive today because they were able to take advantage of modern medicine advances. And they openly say that life in Tibet was absolute hell for anyone not a priest, and that they were considered lower than animals, mainly because animals could do more work. Now, let's backtrack a bit. What about that Chinese invasion in 1951? Well, it's called an invasion because the People's Liberation Army had already stationed themselves along the Western Front with Tibet, and the signing of the 17-point agreement allowed PLA troops, People's Liberation Army troops, to base themselves in the capital of Tibet, Lhasa. And in exchange, I hope I pronounced that right, who cares, China would respect the religious leadership of Tibet and allow it to be autonomous. That lasted about 8 years. Now, there are two different stories about what happened exactly around that time, and both have basically the same cause and effect, strangely. So, in a nutshell, Tibetan rebels had been planning attacks on PLA forces for years, and the Dalai Lama tried to calm the unrest for fear of bloodshed, bullshit. In any case, he packed his bags and went to India, and the Tibetan rebels were crushed by the People's Liberation Army. The other version is pretty much the same, except the rebels had already begun attacks, and the Dalai Lama had already left, and the attacks were on his orders. More likely. Now, life under Chairman Mao, whom I have never liked, was not easy, but seeing how things actually improved under his reign speaks volumes about the Tibetan government's ineptitude. What more can you expect from a reincarnated God King who has spent the last 200 years in exile? Mao was one of the worst leaders ever, and many of you know my low opinion of him. It's enough to blow your mind forever. It's real funny because the life expectancy was so low while the Lama was in direct rule that nowadays, when you hear of pro-Dalai Lama protests in Tibet, it's very likely that not a single person involved in them was even alive previous to 1960. Anyway, I'm done for now. I just got done watching the video from the UK of those ignorant hippies harassing that poor flame holder out of sheer disrespect for the Olympic tradition. I mean, whether all this crap was instigated by the Dalai Lama or not, they're just being opportunists. People around the world should know the truth, and the truth is that Tibet under a Dalai Lama has historically been one that goes against everything the West believes in and fights for. It may be different now. I mean, the current Dalai Lama wears a wristwatch in order to show people that he has been ingratiated into Western culture and intends to modernize the Tibetan people. And all of these stupid people ignore the fact that he wears a robe everywhere he goes, too. I mean, come on. Gandhi wore a robe. Gandhi believed in progress. Gandhi did not wear a wristwatch. Gandhi starved himself when Indian people violently protested. Gandhi was a hero. The Dalai Lama is a preening, self-important coward who encourages violence by remaining silent. Fuck him. Maybe he'll have more luck in his next reincarnation. Better get started on that pyramid soon.